April 7, 1945. Tokuyama Naval Base lay under a gray morning sky when the order came down the passageways of the giant ship. Men snapped to attention in compartments that smelled of steel, oil, and salt. A petty officer with a cracked voice read the movement orders twice to be sure no one had misheard. The battleship Yamato would sail with a small escort to Okinawa. Fuel sufficient for a single run. No air cover promised. Ammunition loaded for a last fight. The words did not say the word sacrifice, but every man heard it between the lines. Seaman Second Class Shigeru Takai opened his notebook and wrote a few slow words before the whistle blew. He had joined to serve on a ship built like a floating mountain. He had memorized the figures as a boy. 9 guns of 18-inch diameter that could throw a shell farther than a man could see. Armor thicker than a farmhouse wall. Displacement heavier than a city block. He had believed in armor. He had believed in the old stories. He kept the notebook small because there was no room aboard for sentiment. Yet the habit of a few lines each morning calmed his hands. He wrote a single sentence. "We are leaving, and we will not return." The ship moved with the steady authority of a glacier. Tugs let go, and the harbor fell behind. The sea opened in long iron-colored bands. The escorts formed up, light cruisers and destroyers that looked like racing dogs trotting beside a bull. On the bridge, the captain stood with his watch officers close enough to speak without raising voices. The reports came up through the ship in a slow heartbeat. Engine revolutions, pressure, bearing, wind. Discipline turned anxiety into routine. Men checked watertight doors again and again. Fire mains were bled and rebled. The cold comfort of procedure wrapped itself around fear. In the upper handling rooms, crews tended the chains of ammunition that fed the great guns. Shells the weight of small cars. Propellant stacked like pale silk. The spaces were clean, polished by work and pride. Down in the boiler rooms, the heat was its own weather. Stokers worked stripped to the waist, skin salted white, eyes stinging, counting beats in their heads as if their own hearts could keep time with the shafts. Every compartment had its sound, and together they made a single voice that said simply, "We are moving forward." The announcement that went through the ship at midday was simple. Enemy aircraft expected. Everyone already knew. The ship's own scouts had seen contrails on distant horizons the week before. Rumors said the Americans could put hundreds of planes over a point of ocean in a single hour. Rumors said radar could see through clouds and darkness and silence. Rumors had been wrong before, but no one could point to a recent example. The old confidence that battleships ruled the sea had withered over 3 years of war. Carriers had become the horizon itself. In the afternoon, the crew drilled. The anti-aircraft mounts ran through traverse and elevation. Men chased faults with wrenches and hammers and careful hands. Gunners wiped sights. Fuse setters recited numbers. Runners rehearsed ladders and hatches until their legs burned. The first officer walked the length of the main deck and looked up at the triple turrets, as if to judge whether faith alone could lift them to the sky. The ship had been built to fight equals. Now it would be asked to swat hornets. As dusk approached, Seaman Takai wrote again by the light of a shielded bulb. The sea was calm. He could feel, more than hear, the slow roll and the rumble in the bones of the hull. He wrote about the smell of barley tea in the mess, the way the older men made jokes that did not quite land, the habit of men to clean shoes they would never again wear on land. He did not write about home. He did not write about the letter he had folded and left with a friend ashore. He wrote instead about the sound of the wind at the bow, a sound that had always meant freedom, and now meant only distance. Night closed without incident. Watches turned over. The sky stayed low and unbroken. Somewhere in that darkness, operators in a small room listened to headphones and studied a faint green line crawl around a glass face. Somewhere far beyond the edge of sight, radio men in a different language marked bearings with soft pencils and drew straight arrows across a map. In the morning, the sea was the color of lead, and the air felt like a hand pressed flat on the deck. The first warning was neither sound nor sight, but a rhythm. Gunners who had practiced until their muscles learned the drill felt their bodies move a fraction ahead of the order. The call went out in a voice that aimed at calm and struck metal. General quarters. The ship pivoted from routine to battle in a breath. Hatches slammed. Dogs turned. Men ran along paths they had already run in their minds 100 times. Telephone talkers pressed headsets hard against their ears. The ship became its plan. The lookouts saw them as a dark thread against the gray, then many threads, then a weave. The escorts shifted to bring their own guns to bear. On the bridge, the captain did not raise his binoculars. He stood with hands light on the edge of the table and listened to the reports stack up into meaning. Altitude, course, speed, types, fighters, torpedo bombers, dive bombers. He knew the names. He knew the doctrine. He also knew the arithmetic. There were too many paths into the circle and not enough hands to block them all. The first dive began like a falling nail driven by a giant hand. Sirens wound up into a single animal wail from every ship in the formation. Tracers reached upward in glowing threads. The air around the bridge thickened with smoke and fragments of paper that had once been orders and charts, and now were only ash. A bomb struck far forward and threw a wall of air down the length of the deck. The ship took the blow like a boxer stepping into a punch. Steel rang. Men who had never spoken. The same prayer spoke it together without sound. The next wave came low and fast. Torpedo bombers skimmed the wavetops in lines that broke and reformed under the stabbing fire of the small guns. The ship turned to comb the wakes, but a hull that size could not dance, only lean. One torpedo struck the port side with a wet thud, followed by a sound that was not a sound but a subtraction. The deck underfoot lifted, paused, settled unevenly. Lights flickered, and then held. In Damage Control Central, officers ran fingers along diagrams and called for status by compartment. Pumps started. Doors closed. Men who had trained to move faster than fear moved faster than fear. The next came from the opposite quarter as if time itself had doubled back. Another hit. Then another. The ship began to list in a way that felt wrong to feet that knew every mood of this hull. The list turned routine movements into climbing. Ladder rungs bit hands harder. Voices needed to be louder by small degrees. The main battery director followed the sky because that is what it had been made to do. The great guns spoke once, twice, with a heaviness that said they were doing what they could, not what they had been meant for. Their thunder toppled men at the mounts and shook dust out of places no broom had ever reached. Aircraft fell. Some hit the sea and knifed in as if the ocean were soft and welcoming. Some disintegrated mid-air in a white flash that left behind only a smear of smoke. For each that fell, two more seemed to appear. The escorts fought as if anger could conjure armor. One destroyer disappeared in a blossom of flame and steam, and then was not a destroyer at all, but black water flecked with small things that used to be parts of a ship. The men on Yamato watched and did not watch, because the brain will now and then refuse what the eyes insist upon. Somewhere aft, a fire took hold that did not want to leave. Foam spread like winter across iron. Hose teams crouched behind splinter shields that shook with invisible impacts. The smell changed from oil and hot iron to something sweeter and worse. The list deepened by a degree, and then another. In the plotting rooms, men changed pencils not because the lead was worn, but because their hands needed a new thing to hold. Telephone circuits crackled with voices that spoke in clipped syllables that left no room for doubt. Confirm. Repeat. Acknowledge. Seaman Takai had been assigned to a ready ammunition party for a medium mount. The work was simple and heavy. He counted shells in his head because numbers were something to carry in a place where almost everything else had to be put down. He did not see the aircraft that dropped the bomb that killed the petty officer to his right. He only felt the sudden emptiness of a space that had been occupied a heartbeat before, as if time had put a finger to a map and smeared a man away. He stepped into the gap because the body knows where to go when the plan tears. He did not think about anything except the next shell and the next. He thought of shoes lined neatly by the hatch, because order makes courage possible. By late morning, the sky had become a busy machine. The sea around the ship was a ledger of white scars where torpedoes had run. The list made the main deck a hill. Men leaned their shoulders into the hill and moved up and down as if walking a street in a mountain town. The captain ordered counterflooding. Water roared through spaces designed to be empty. The ship straightened some and then sagged again like a man trying to stand with too much weight in his arms. A lull came, thin and brief. It felt like a breath stolen from someone else's lungs. Men used it to bind wounds, to swap burned gloves for unburned ones, to look once toward the horizon and see that there was no help, only the long, indifferent line where the sea met the sky. The Americans came again. The sound was a fabric tearing. Bombs fell in clusters that stitched the deck from stern toward midships. A near miss opened seams that had not known daylight since the ship first touched water. The great hull shuddered in a way that made even the most faithful understand. In damage control, an officer with a pencil behind one ear kept his voice level, while the room became hotter by degrees. The needles on the boards told a story that could not be rewritten. He ordered men out of compartments he had crawled through as a younger man with a tape measure and a notebook. He learned what it meant to abandon a space while there was still time to leave it. He wrote a last note on the corner of a diagram for someone who would never read it. The end began as a slow roll, and then quickened. The list did not feel like a single angle, but like a decision being made in steps. The crew fought each degree as if a ship could be argued back to level by persistence. Loose gear slid. Water found new paths. Below, men stepped from rungs into water that had not been there a minute before, water that was not yet cold because the ship was still warm with work and fire. Above, the sky was a ceiling of smoke from 100 burning things. The order to abandon ship traveled badly through spaces that no longer understood words. Men heard it as a change in the air, as the sudden appearance of life jackets in hands that had been holding tools, as the way older petty officers looked at younger men, and then away. The captain stayed on the bridge because the story wanted him to, and because he wanted to. He turned once and looked not at the sea or the enemy or the charts, but at the men, and he nodded in a way that said more than rank could say. Seaman Takai reached the rail with 3 others from his mount. The deck was a slope that wanted to be a wall. They went hand to wrist in a chain without talking about it. The ocean was close and far at the same time. He could smell it as something clean under the smoke and oil. He thought, briefly and with surprise, that he was not afraid of the water. He was afraid of leaving the ship. The ship had been the world. The ship had been a promise. He waited for a count that no one gave and then went over when his hands told him to. The water hit like a door. Cold now. He came up into a rain of ash. The ship loomed beside him, a cliff sliding by. He had the sudden childish urge to push against it with both hands as if he could straighten it in place. Men splashed near him and then were farther away because the ship pulled the sea as it moved. The sound changed from metal and fire to something low and continuous, the sound a great building might make as it settles forever. The final explosion was not a single note, but an argument between fire and steel. It rose through the hull and out into the air in a tower that folded itself in on the way up. Men turned their faces away, and still felt it on their skin. For a long moment there was only bright, and then the bright went away, and left a darkness more honest than shadow. Pieces of the ship fell back, in a strange, gentle rain. The sea took the rest without comment. In the hours that followed, the survivors floated in a widening, speckled field of oil and wood, and things that had been part of a ship and were now parts of the sea. Some clung to planks. Some lay still in their jackets and looked at clouds. The escorts that could still move circled once and again, pulling men out of the water with hooks in hands, and then broke away because the sky still had teeth. The Americans wheeled overhead, and then were gone, leaving only distant smudges that might have been smoke or might have been the imagination. Seaman Takai counted breaths. He did not think about what the ship had been, only about the next breath and the next. When a destroyer's hull finally blocked the sky above him, he stared at the streaks of rust along her side and thought, absurdly, that he should have cleaned those streaks on the Yamato last week when he had the time. Hands reached down. He reached up. The world became steel again and shouting, and the sharp smell of cordite and wool. A petty officer he had never seen pressed a canteen into his hands and said something he did not hear. He drank and coughed and drank again. News travels even across oceans of silence. In the weeks that followed, in barracks and huts and caves, men spoke the name of the ship in tones that were part pride and part grief and part something like recognition. The largest battleship in the world had sailed to its death under orders that turned bravery into arithmetic. The old belief that armor could outstare the sky died with it. In places where maps still mattered, officers put a finger on Okinawa and drew circles that meant air range and wrote numbers that meant sorties per day, and never once wrote the word battleship as a solution to any problem. In a small hospital room months later, Seaman Takai turned the pages of his notebook with bandaged fingers. The pages were wrinkled from salt and rough drying. He read his first sentence again and did not change it. "We are leaving, and we will not return." He added a second sentence at the bottom of that page with a pencil someone had cut short to share more times. "We were a mountain, and mountains cannot fly." He closed the book and set it under his pillow, because you do not throw away a map of the world you once lived in. Years after the war, men who had worn the same uniform on different decks agreed on one thing without needing to discuss it. The day the Yamato sailed proved something that had been growing for years. The sea belonged to the air now. Courage did not change that. Armor did not change that. The sound of a great gun rolling back in recoil did not change that. The ship had been a masterpiece in the language of an earlier century, read aloud in a world that had learned a new tongue. Yet memory held more than defeat. Those who had walked her decks remembered the exact feel of the teak under bare feet at dawn. They remembered the shadow of the barrel across the water, like a bridge the world could never build. They remembered the way a ship that size could still answer a helmsman's touch with something like grace. They remembered the pride of polishing brass until it caught first light and threw it back. They remembered how work done well could quiet fear for hours at a time. They remembered a crew made of boys and men who learned to move as if tied by invisible ropes, each trusting the others to hold. The day the Yamato sailed to its death was not the day the sea changed. The sea had already changed. It was the day a nation learned, at a cost written in steel and fire, that faith in the past could not pay for the present. It was the day men, inside a mountain, discovered that the horizon now belonged to wings. And it was the day a seaman with a small notebook understood that even the largest thing a man can build must obey the simplest rule of war. The side that reaches first with enough will decide what survives. He looked up at a sky empty of planes and wrote a final line without dates or names. The ship is gone, but the sea keeps the sound of her passing, and those who heard it will not forget.